Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture of week 6 on modernization and creative communication. So today we will learn about radio broadcasting and communication. Now in the previous two lectures we have focused on the two techniques of communication. One was the letters and the other was the telephone. And now we will focus on the radio broadcasting. Now, see, the advent of radio in the 1920s and 1930s marked a transformative period in the history of communication. Radio signals, as described speaking into the air, I would like to remind you that this is where our book takes its name from, had an uncanny quality, evoking metaphors of telepathy, scenes and spiritual connections. Unlike previous communication technologies, radio broadcasts disseminated information to an infinite audience lacking clear boundaries of reception. This inherent openness raised questions about intimacy, audience agency, and the nature of dialogue in the age of mass communication. Now let's see what broadcasting means. Broadcasting is the process of sending audio content through radio waves to a wide and dispersed audiences. Now, how is this different from something like a phone call? Well, in a phone call, we have point-to-point communication, one-to-one communication, right? It's a private conversation between two individuals. But broadcasting, on the other hand, is meant for public dissemination, like one to the many, right? So instead of one person talking to another directly, you are essentially speaking to an entire group, and anyone with the right receiver can tune in and listen. Over time, radio has evolved from its early days as private telegraphy to what we know today as mass broadcasting. Now, to really understand how radio broadcasting developed, we need to look back at its origin. In the 1890s, Guglielmo Marconi invented the wireless telegraph, right? At that time, it was mainly seen as a tool for point-to-point communication, like a more advanced version of the telegraph. But this technology had a fascinating quirk. Radio waves were open-ended. That which means what? Which means anyone with the right receiver could intercept the signal and listen in, which made private communication very difficult. People compared this to telepathy or even seance because of how mysterious it seemed, hearing voices without seeing the speaker. Fast forward to 1915 and 1916 and we see a visionary moment with David Sarnoff. He proposed that radio could become a household music box reaching every home, right? So Sarnoff understood the potential of radio not as a tool for individual communication but as a medium to broadcast to mass audiences, which set the stage for what radio would eventually become. Now, early radio was really about point to point communication, but it started to shift towards mass broadcasting during First World War. The government and large corporations saw the potential in radio to reach many people at once. They began shaping radio into the medium we know today, where one broadcaster can reach n number of people, okay, a group of target audience, right? So one major turning point was the Communication Act of 1934. This law is very important to understand. This law defined broadcasting as a public service, which made it distinct from things like telephones, which were considered common carriers. The Federal Communication Commission (FCC) was created to regulate broadcasting, making sure it served the public interest. Now, let's see what was one of the biggest challenges here. One of the big challenges with broadcasting is that it is essentially a private transmission with a public reception. When we when we talk about common carriage like the telephones, the message is delivered directly to one person to the other at the end, right? So there is a speaker and there is a receiver. But broadcasting sends out a signal that anyone can receive, but there's no guarantee that it will reach or resonate with a specific person. So though it was understood or that was presumed that this radio broadcasting will fetch its target audience, it was not really so. Broadcasters are speaking to large anonymous audiences, and the lack of direct feedback can make it very difficult to gauge how the message is being received. Because when we talk about communication, in whichever form it is and in whichever medium you take, you cannot deny the fact or you cannot deny the concept of perception. So perception is always a pertinent problem in communication. So this lack of interaction, again here, radio was one-way communication. There is a sender and there are receivers, right? Receivers with different perceptions, different mood, different opinions, okay, and they were receiving. There was no way to talk back. Okay, so this lack of interaction is one of the unique challenges of broadcasting. Now, here's something very interesting about radio that might seem again a little eerie. There's something that I was talking about, the telephone, right? Here also, in case of radio, there is the same thing happens. Radio takes away the physical presence of the speaker. Again, see, what we are left with is just the voice, which can feel strange or disconnected. In telephone, at least you open up your identity, you share your identity, who is speaking to whom, and even these two individuals know each other or introduce each other before they make the interaction, they make the conversation. But this is something that was not there, because for him in radio broadcasting, message is more important than the speaker, right? So in 1936, Rudolf Arheim coined the term voices without bodies to describe this phenomena. So, voice, the message becomes important here. People were used to this face-to-face communication where they could see the speaker, read their body language and respond to these visual cues, or the non-verbal cues that we talk about, but this was not present when this radio came into play. So, but with radio, all these non-verbal signals, the physical non-verbal signals were vanished, they were gone. So, it created a new form of communication that disrupted the traditional sense of intimacy we were used to, right? Now, building on that idea, one of the biggest issues with radio broadcasting was the erosion of intimacy. Broadcasters were now speaking into a microphone, not to a live audience. They couldn't see the people they were addressing, so there was no applause, no laughter, or any of the feedback performers normally relied on. So, no feedback was there. As I mentioned, it was very one-way communication. And we go back, I think radio brought back the idea of Aristotelian concept of communication. There is a speaker, there is a message, and there is a receiver, right? So, in 1924, Herbert Hoover, who later became the President of the United States, complained about this. He called it, I quote what he called it deadly inexpressive microphone, because it was so difficult to connect with people when you couldn't see them or hear them. Performers especially found it very hard, because they missed the energy and response of a live audience, right? And it's then for the speaker it becomes ultimately very uncanny. They do not get that encouragement that they used to get earlier when there was a physical interaction or physical public speaking. Okay, now broadcasters knew they had to find ways to rebuild the lost sense of intimacy. So that came up as a challenge for them. One way they did this was through compensatory dialogism, which means they started speaking directly to the audience, almost as if they were having a conversation with each listener individually. To create a sense of participation, radio shows encouraged listeners to write in fan letters or take part in contests. This gave the audience a chance to interact even if it wasn't live. Okay, so another technique was introduced, and this technique was live studio audiences for some broadcasts, right? So this allowed performers to get at least immediate feedback, some feedback they would be getting through this kind of a technique. And how it helped them? It helped them to recreate the feeling of a live performance, right? So over time, new radio genres developed, like domestic dramas and soap operas that had a more conversational and familiar tone through which at least audience can get connected with, right? So these formats brought a fresh air, a sense of connection back to the radio. Comedies also took advantage of live audiences and used internal dialogues to stimulate interactions, making the experience feel more dynamic, right? But despite all these challenges, radio still managed to create a sense of mass participation, and one of the most important or one of the most powerful things about radio is that it brought people together. Even though they were physically separated, still they were united, right? Cantrell and Alport, two psychologists from the 1930s, talked about how radio created what they called a consciousness of kind. What is this? Essentially, people felt like they were part of a larger community because they were all listening to the same broadcast, having the same experience at the same time. These were imagined communities, okay, and where listeners felt connected to others they would never meet simply by tuning to the same programs. Now, there's something special about live broadcasting. It's more authentic and feels more immediate because anything can happen in the moment. One famous example is Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats. Roosevelt was able to build a huge amount of trust with the American public by using live radio. He spoke directly to them as in a casual, intimate way, even doing small things like asking for a glass of water during broadcast. This humanized him and made people like him, like he was speaking to them very personally. Another example I would mention here is Kate Smith's Word-Bond Drive in 1943. She did a live marathon radio broadcast to raise money during Second World War, and people responded to her sincerity and dedication. The live format gave these broadcasts a sense of urgency and authenticity that pre-recorded content just couldn't match. Now, as radio grew, so did its connection to advertising, right? Radio station needed to make money, and advertising became the primary way to fund programming. However, this commercialization raised concerns. Adorno, a philosopher and critic, believed that radio was fostering a false sense of intimacy. I repeat, a false sense of intimacy. He argued that listeners were being manipulated into passive consumers, just sitting back and absorbing content without questioning it. But not everyone agreed with Adorno. Sociologist Robert Merton argued that radio could actually help build real social bonds, especially during times of crisis. He pointed to examples where radio helped unite people and encourage collective action, showing that it wasn't at all about manipulation. So, to wrap up, I would say radio broadcasting completely transformed communication. It allowed us to reach mass audience in a way that was never possible before. But along with this transformation, along with this kind of a transformation came new challenges. What are the challenges? Number one, questions about intimacy. Number two, sincerity, and the fact that communication was now disembodied. Okay, so but then despite these issues, radio succeeded in creating a sense of community and shared experience. It shows us the potential of mediated communication to foster human connection, and even when we are separated by distance. Thank you.